Hello again, and welcome to today's broadcast of Practically Political, where pragmatists talk politics. I'm Dave Spencer, founder of Practically Republican. We have another very special guest today. Jon Allen is co-author of the #1 bestseller, Shattered, Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign, the inside account of what went wrong deep inside Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential bid. Jon is also the head of content at SidewayTocom, a columnist at Roll Call, and an adjunct professor at Northwestern University. He has written about national politics for more than a decade, including as a former Washington bureau chief for Bloomberg News and a former White House bureau chief for Politico. Jon, welcome to the show, and congratulations on the #1 best-selling success of the book.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
Well, Jon, before we get started, I must admit that as a pragmatist and a longtime GOP supporter, I have never felt more humiliated or helpless about where our party stands on policy, legislation, and comportment. As much as Trump's innate dishonesty disgusts me, I'm equally distressed by the lack of character and backbone of GOP leaders in Congress. I guess my question is, do you see a tipping point ahead where more common sense politics and integrity kick in and these guys finally have to start having a spine? Or is it going to take a thumping in the 2018 elections?
I think it usually takes some sort of external event for members of Congress and members of a party to change their behavior. So maybe it's a 2018 election. Maybe it is the potential decline in Donald Trump's popularity rating. I think when members of Congress believe that it costs them more to be with him than against him, then they will move toward being against him. And if they feel like it's better to be with him, then they'll be with him. So I think we've come to a place where our partisan politics sometimes trump, no pun intended, trump what you're looking for, which is sort of common sense approaches. It's a sort of a really amazing situation we have here that creates a lot of paralysis. And I think what you've got really in both parties right now is a weakening of the parties in terms of their ability to select candidates, their ability to elect the folks they would prefer through primaries and then winning the general election. And at the same time, intense partisan division among those who do get elected. And that's reflective, I think, of a pretty intense partisan division within the country, just among the general public.
Back to the most important topic, the book. And I guess my first question would be, what was it that drew you to writing Shattered? And as you look back, when did you first get a sense that Hillary Clinton might be headed for such a disastrous outcome?
As my co-author Amy Parnes and I write in the book, we believed that Secretary Clinton was going to win the presidency right up until the time on election night where it became clear that Donald Trump had won, which was a little bit before she conceded, but definitely on election night. We had seen a lot of warning signs. We write about this not only in the introduction to the book, but also you can see throughout the book a lot of the warning signs that were there that were at odds with public polling. And, we didn't have any special insight into the fact that the numbers were not going to hold in some of those Rust Belt states for her, or that Trump was going to overperform in some places. That was a surprise to us. In terms of why we decided to do this book, an agent came to us in the middle of 2012 and said, everybody's focused on Obama and Romney. Somebody ought to think about Hillary Clinton. And so we wrote a book about her time at the State Department that detailed not only her implementation of Obama's foreign policy, but also how she set up to run for president this time. And so this was the natural outgrowth of that. As soon as that book came out in early 2014, we signed up with the publisher to do a book on this election, and we decided somewhat into the process, but fairly early into the process, that we were going to focus on her. We thought we were probably writing the story of America's first woman president, and then on election day that changed, but we didn't actually have to change a lot of the reporting because, as I was saying before, we were noticing problems all along, even if we couldn't quite see the full picture.
Well, it would be fair to call the Trump campaign an ongoing circus. After reading the book, most people will be surprised to learn how dysfunctional the Clinton campaign was as well. Can you talk about how the flaws in Hillary's basic character contributed to her ultimate failure?
Sure. I think there are a few things to look at. Number one, there was this sort of negative cloud hanging over her that came from, first and foremost, this private email server that she'd set up that ended up having classified information on it. That was a political problem for her for many months, where she wouldn't apologize for it, and her aides tried to get her to do it, and she wouldn't do it, and then finally kind of did it. And I don't think the public really accepted that as an apology. It looked like she was trying to hide something. One of the big knocks on her is that people think that she's deceptive and always hiding something. attached to that, you've got the Wall Street speeches she gave, speeches to Wall Street banks at a time of rising populism. Some of her advisors had told her she shouldn't do that, and her response to them was, they're going to hit me for something. So I think that was pretty tone deaf. The big thing from a campaign standpoint was a lack of a clear mission. She was not able to articulate for the public or even for her own campaign aides, why her, why now? So I think the public could tell from Bernie Sanders that his basic mission was take money and power from those who have it and redistribute it. Donald Trump's was sort of a nationalist approach, and you could fit most of his main policies into that basket. It was very clear what he was offering to do for people. And for her, she was for a million things and kind of for nothing. There was no, you need to elect me because I'm going to get X done for you that you care about. And I think that harmed her. I think it prevented her campaign from having real organizing principles.
Of all the passages in the book, and I think it was the Canary in the Auto Plant chapter, when you said, instead of capturing the politics of the moment, Hillary once again tried to talk about why she was right. And I thought that really was a perfect encapsulation of how tone deaf they were to truly how hurting many people in this country were. And, at least Trump pretended to care about them.
We have this story in the book. She goes into Michigan, this is in the primaries. She knows that people care about the economy. There were three issues that swing voters in Michigan cared about, both in the primary and swing voters in the general election. They cared about trade, and trade. And Bernie Sanders came out and said, more or less, I would throw every trade deal in the fire. I would, hang everyone that's ever negotiated a trade deal, and no one will ever say trade in my presence without lightning striking them. And, he didn't actually say those things, but that was basically his message. Hillary Clinton's message was, I'm now against the Trans-Pacific Partnership that I helped negotiate as Secretary of State. But instead of saying she was really against it, she said, here are the conditions under which I could support it. It sounded so wishy-washy, so mealy-mouthed. I think she really hurt herself there and never really recovered.
There was definitely the flip-flopping. And you had mentioned before the email surfer. But, one thing that stood out in my mind in the book over and over again was the continuance of the Clinton legacy of Bill and Hillary to ever admit any wrongdoing until they're charged with a crime. Can you talk a little more about this sense of hubris?
Yeah, I think that they've been under attack fairly in some cases and unfairly in others for the last 25 years. And they fight. Their view of things is, if you've got something on me, prove it. And if you prove it, maybe I can prove that it's not actually a crime. And their basic want is to go into battle and to not admit to wrongdoing. Now, Bill Clinton has the capacity, and we've seen this before, once he's fully caught, to actually take advantage of contrition and redemption cycles and sort of beg for people's forgiveness. And, he's got the aw shucks thing going for him. She never really does that. I think she's somebody who does not like to publicly admit her weaknesses. And I think that that's one of the reasons people often describe her as not entirely human or say that she needs to be humanized, because she's got a weakness. It's not something she wants to talk about. And, of course, the things that make us human are our weaknesses.
You talk about that in the book, and even on the back cover when you talk about after the Michigan primary, how she was willing to point the finger at anything and everyone other than herself. And sure enough, she resurfaced recently, and she seems to have the same flawed perspective about who was to blame and her role in the defeat. And in that recent speech, literally everyone under the sun was blamed except herself.
Including the Democratic National Committee. Of all the people you would think she might not blame, it would be the DNC. She raised $1 billion, and she says they didn't have enough money and their data team wasn't good enough. Well, she had a tremendous data team, some of the best in the business, and they didn't, their stuff didn't end up being all that great either. So I think one of the interesting things about the book, now that she has come out and started talking about things and does blame sort of everyone but herself, is you get a lot of the context of the thinking behind that. Part of it is that her basic unwillingness to accept blame, and part of it is the sort of strategic level of casting blame at others so that people don't look at what she did wrong or what her aides did wrong. It's sort of one way to try to keep a circular firing squad at bay is to keep all the guns pointed at someone else. And I think that's what they did.
It really transcends down to the Democratic Party as a whole, because they have pulled off the incredible feat of seeming to actually lose ground during what many people would say has been the spectacular train wreck of the Trump presidency. And there's all these reasons why they lost, but there's not any reasons about how they're going to win or reconnect with these working class white voters that were their bread and butter at one point.
And not only their bread and butter, but hers. In 2008, her primary base was working class whites. And then this time she went in and she said, the way to win the primary is to run up the score with people of color. And that's true. If you can run up the score with people of color in a Democratic primary, you get outsized numbers of delegates. And their delegate math is somewhat complicated, but basically there are more delegates from places that are more likely to vote Democratic, and therefore you end up with a lot of urban voters and a lot of people of color. And so while she was doing that, she was alienating that original base of working class whites, in part from neglect and in part, in specific response to things she was promising other constituencies. And then she wins the primary, and she doesn't do anything to address those working class whites that had been alienated in the general election. And her campaign's belief was essentially that they could slice and dice the electorate and turn out as many people who agreed with her as possible, as opposed to trying to persuade some of those who were on the fence or didn't agree with her.
And the amazing thing, John, is that it's axiomatic in politics that if you play the identity game, you better include everybody. And it almost got to the point where some whites felt they were a minority in her election.
I mean, there is some truth to that in that if you look at her coalition, that, I think the working class whites felt that they were, if not a minority, were certainly not being catered to and in some cases being insulted. And, you go back to, for instance, the deplorables comment, the basket of deplorables that she talked about in early September. I think for a candidate who is running on a platform of or a slogan of stronger together, the idea that people are, could be lumped together in a basket of deplorables, or as she put it, are irredeemable, I think it was very offensive to a lot of people, even some of those who might have been open to voting for her. The other thing she did, and we hadn't talked about this yet from a strategic standpoint, is her team decided that their main goal was to disqualify Donald Trump. That was what they had to do for her to win the election, rather necessarily than selling her or doing both. And to some extent, they were, as we write in the book, they were successful at doing that. About a fifth of Donald Trump's voters said they thought he was unfit for the presidency and still voted for him. So, she didn't make the sale for herself because she was so focused on trying to prove that he was incapable of being president or so toxic as to be bad for the country.
Yeah, she violated the 3 golden rules, and that is you can't be elected by running against the other guy. You've got to give people a reason to vote for you, never take a single voter for granted, and never disparage a single voter. And one of the most fascinating parts of the book is when you look inside the Clinton headquarters on election night and people were telling her not to call at 2:30 and all this. I'm just wondering if you could tell us what it was like interviewing these key figures in the wake of such a devastating night.
I mean, they were still in shock and still traumatized, days and weeks later for the most part, still in a state of disbelief. And, I think one of the strengths of the book, and my co-author and I decided on, day after the election, we were really going to focus on telling the story of what happened behind closed doors that night. And people cooperated with us. A really sort of an incredible story of a campaign that thought they were going to win, and then the numbers start coming in. And it's almost like they were a team that had a 6-point lead, and they were on the other team's 2-yard line with a minute left to go, and the quarterback throws an interception. Other team comes down the field to score 7, and they're all standing around looking at each other, and they know they've got 45 seconds or so to try to get it back. But that election night was sort of like, once they started seeing the returns come in, they knew that it was probably a slow march to defeat for the rest of the night. And there was never a point after those early returns came in where they could be anything more than Pollyanna-ish in their optimism about hoping that something might happen. The people that dealt with the data knew pretty early. And, we sort of go through her machinations that night and her evolutions that night from thinking she was going to win, including practicing her victory speech, but not the defeat, not the concession speech. Several phone calls between the White House and Secretary Clinton and her campaign, including 2 between her and President Obama, and just this incredible, for lack of a better term, feeling of being shattered among her and her aides.
In a sidebar, in retrospect, what kind of president do you think Hillary Clinton would have made?
It's hard to know exactly. I think she's somebody who understands the levers of power and would have put in place a lot of people with familiarity with the establishment and the ability to work in the margins to get some policies done. And yet, at the same time, it's hard to watch that campaign and think that she would be like gliding through in any way in terms of her management. She would be dealing with a Republican Congress, so she wouldn't be able to get much done on the legislative front. And, one of the knocks on President Trump right now is that he got in the way of the gears of justice, or, that's certainly something that's been talked about a lot lately. She is also somebody who has found ways to try to keep the truth hidden.
As far as Trump goes, to use a hockey term, It seems like his administration has been flooding the zone, with one controversy or disaster or another, and which really distracts people from the previous story or important news or whatever. What would be your advice to people who maybe don't follow this stuff as closely as we do, but feel overwhelmed by trying to keep up with the ongoing soap opera?
Take a deep breath. None of these stories in a vacuum is the end of the world. I think that the Trump administration has struggled for a variety of reasons to set and follow a narrative. The president himself bounces from topic to topic, and he seems to be very capable of winning a news cycle in terms of driving what people are paying attention to on a particular day, but very weak at sustaining that. And the thing is, in Washington, it's very difficult to get things done. And in order to get your legislative priorities passed through Congress, you really have to have message discipline day after day after day. And he hasn't done that. And I think he has alienated some of the Republicans in Congress because they're tired of having to answer questions about Russia and about whether he obstructed justice and whatever the tweet of the day is. I think there's some exhaustion there. So, I think for the public, in terms of watching this, I would say just take a deep breath, assess it every once in a while. I still believe that short of some sort of legal action, that Donald Trump will win or lose the next election based on the state of the economy and his ability or inability to convince the public that he has made it better for them.
Yeah, and all the chaos, incompetence, and ethical issues has caused inaction, and I've always believed that inaction is better than bad action.
Well, and there's some of that too. I don't think voters necessarily are. I mean, they say they don't like dysfunction in Congress. Maybe they don't like dysfunction, but they definitely seem to be pretty comfortable with inaction.
I wouldn't mind if you would just take a minute and tell our listeners a little bit about your work at Sidewire and how the site takes a different approach to cutting through the deluge of the 24-hour news cycle.
We are basically the platform for text chats among politics and policy and technology experts. And the idea is that we have credentialed people who are experts in their area of study or area of practice, and they can have conversations about issues without the noise and the trolling that you see on other media platforms. So basically, anyone can read the chats that we do. They're online at SidewayTocom, but only the experts are allowed to post. And what that does is allows them to get into substantive and sophisticated discussions. So if you're interested in education policy, you can go find a chat about education and where that's headed. If you're interested in the Comey hearings, you'll see some people talking about what they mean. One example that I like is President Trump rolled back some sanctions on Russia, and the whole world on Twitter just kind of blew up into flames saying, oh my God, Trump is repealing these sanctions on Russia. And we quickly had a bunch of experts get online and talk to each other about whether this was really something bad that was happening. And folks who had worked in the Obama administration said President Obama would have made the same decision on these same things in the same way. And in fact, we were working on that at the end of the Obama administration. So, I think a lot of times we can be a place where reality is more evident than it can be on other platforms. And again, Sidewire.com.
Well, Jonathan, I've decided that I want to invest in your next book about the Trump presidency. Maybe you can call it Snookered.
The next project is being discussed as we speak.
As a practical optimist, I always ask one last question of our guests, and that is, what do you see as the good news coming out of Washington, and what gives you at least a little hope for the future?
My take on what the good news is that our system seems to be bearing up fairly well to the challenges of a president who doesn't seem to want to operate within it. So, you've seen courts stand up and say, no, you can't do this. You've seen Congress stand up and say, no, you can't do that. When the president has run afoul of our norms, if not our laws, that the system is pretty well designed to handle that.
You've been listening to our conversation with Jonathan Allen, co-author of the #1 bestseller, Shattered, Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign, the inside account of what went wrong deep inside Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. John, thanks so much for appearing on the show, and I really look forward to speaking with you again.
I really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
So that's it for today. I'll see you on our next round of Practically Political, where we go beyond the deluge of everyday news to dive deeper into American politics. I'm Dave Spencer. Have a great week.